on with the presentation.
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you, Mario, for joining us here today. We're also proud and delighted to have you with us today, share with your experience with the rest of the industry. But before I let Maria take the stage to share her experience and the take on this topic, I'd like to emphasize on why we believe it's important to talk about clinical practice and clinical investigations for medical devices, especially in the pre-market stage. We're seeing a trend happening in the industry in general worldwide, not only from the regulatory perspective, but also from an end user and procurement perspective, where the requirements for clinical evidence are ever increasing. People are becoming more aware of the importance of illustrating device clinical efficiency and safety before anything else. And with the introduction of the new version of the ISO 14155 standard, which is a good clinical practice standard for medical device clinical investigations, there's a number of additional requirements and observations that we need to make sure are highlighted to the industry so that we can continue conducting successful clinical operations. But before we dig into today's topic, I'd like to ask a question to the audience. Etienne, would you mind sharing the poll with the audience? And because I have the screen in front of me, I can't read out the question, but please read out the question for us if you can, Etienne.
Okay, have you heard of GCP or ISO 14155 before? Looks like we have a few votes coming in. Looks like 13 yes so far. Okay, that number.
So I'm always a little bit curious in hearing people responding to this question, because apparently it very much depends on whether you're based out of the US or Americas or other parts of the world or not, whether ISO 14155 is and has been of interest for you, because it is not the most commonly referred standard when it comes to regulatory frameworks to be used. But we'll get to that a little bit later, why that might be.
Okay, so far 105 votes on yes and 21 votes no. So looks to me about 80-20.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So it sounds to me like a lot of you have put some efforts and work into complying with the standard so far. Some of you might be less known to it. But the reason for good clinical practice was really put in place, and the reason for why it's so essential for medical device companies, but also a lot of other organizations that are conducting clinical operations, is because when we're doing clinical research or clinical trials or clinical studies in general with humans, it is essential that we take good care of the participants that are participating in our studies. So back in 1964, part of a meeting that was held in Finland, an organization called the World Medical Association came up with a guideline called Good Clinical Practice and put that into a writing where the focus was to provide, or the goal was to provide a standardization for ethical and scientific quality when you're reporting and conducting trials that involve human subjects. And a lot of people in the medical device industry might think that this is somewhat of a strange thing to need to comply with, because a big part of, for example, medical device manufacturing is that you make sure that safety and efficacy and everything that has to do with the use of the device is perfect when you conduct your validation and verification of your device. And almost everybody probably believes that their medical device is perfect before it's put into a human body. But we all know that that's not always the case, especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals. We have biological influences on it as well. We need to make sure that if we're introducing a potential risk to a participant or a subject, a human that is using our device, that risk is at least minimal, and we take the correct ethical approaches to introducing new devices and treatments to people. So compliance with good clinical practice provides a certain standard for the public, that is participants and patients, that their rights and safety and well-being, including being included in a study, are taken care of. And not only that the data that is produced conducting a clinical investigation is also credible. The ISO 14155 is an international standard that was adapted for medical devices specifically. And that is because for years and decades, when the first good clinical practice guideline was produced back in 64, there was not a lot of talk about whether you're talking about a pharmaceutical product or a medical device product. So a group of smart people decided that we needed to have a common way of talking about good clinical practice when we're handling human subjects in clinical research. What's important to note, though, is that medical devices tend to be very independent when it comes to defining names and conventions for attributes and legal texts. So the reason why this is called clinical investigations is not a clinical trial is not really well known, but clinical investigation is the equivalent of a clinical study or a clinical trial. So don't be too alarmed seeing that naming convention, because I know that both the European regulators and American regulators and other regulators in Asia, they use different terminology for this: clinical investigations, clinical study, clinical trial. But all in all, it's the same thing. And the standard was designed to provide standardization for good clinical practice in those kind of activities where you include human subjects. Bear in mind that this standard does cover medical devices, and if you have a medical device that has a diagnostic, in vitro diagnostic component to it, there is an equivalent standard that you might want to look at as well. And we might even focus on that in another webinar if needed. So today our focus is on this standard, and it's important to note that this standard was actually updated from another version that was released back in 2011 to a new version now in 2020. The issue in Europe is that the European Union actually included the standard in a reference in the creation of the European Medical Device Regulation. The standard that was referred there was the 2011 version of the standard. What that means is that a lot of people think that is the standard to follow, and you don't have to worry about the 2020. But what legal text and what legal advisors say is that it doesn't really matter. If the latest version of the standard replaces the earlier one, that is the standard to follow. So even though the old version might still be referred to in the old MDR text, it is the latest version that you need to follow, because the outdated version is an outdated version. The major changes that happened from 2011 to 2020 are actually quite significant, and they're, I'd say, in line with what was happening in the EU MDR regulation changes in Europe, but also in line with what was happening in the 13485 standard when it comes to global general risk management. There's a new summary of good clinical practice principles when it comes to medical device studies. There are now paragraphs on registration of a clinical investigation in public databases, introduction of elements of risk-based monitoring, which has not been a topic of much interest until now for medical device studies. The introduction of a clinical quality management system, overall risk management in your clinical study or clinical trial process, statistical considerations, guidance for ethical committees, so how to evaluate, for example, clinical study protocols from an RB or an ethical committee perspective, and the application of the standard for also post-market activities. Some of these changes are just a couple of paragraphs. Some of these are a couple of pages of new requirements and sections. When it comes down to of identifying where this standard is applicable and at what time point, it really comes down to where you are in your clinical development stage. But if you only look at the naming convention of the standard, which is human subjects, the standard is applicable in those clinical development stages where you have or introduce human subjects in your activities. It doesn't really matter what descriptor or naming convention you use for your clinical study, first in human pilot study, safety study, exploratory study, or phase 3 study, pre-market, pivotal, PMA, post-market clinical investigation. I can go on and on. As long as there's a human subject involved in one or another way in using or application of your device or product in a clinical pathway, that standard might be applicable in one or many phases of your activity. Maria will talk a little bit about that later, and where that change of pre and post market comes in at play when you look at the standard. But it's essential for us to note that the naming conventions and the names that we use for our activities don't matter. Even though the standard is called clinical investigations, the naming convention or the application of it all comes down to whether you are introducing a human subject to your device or not. And if you are, that standard is in most commonly applicable. And the same goes for FDA regulations and regulatory texts that also cover good clinical practice. Which leads me to one of the last slides that I have for today. How is good clinical practice related to legal requirements, and how is it regulated? In Europe, it's an integral part of the EU MDR. So the EU MDR refers to the ISO 14155 standard when it comes to clinical investigations and clinical data, or clinical evidence, and clinical data that's generated from a specific activity. This is regulated by not only the legal text, but also requirements put forth by local ethical committees in different countries in Europe, but also competent authorities when you're applying for clinical investigational permits. The US FDA and a lot of other organizations globally, like CFDA and others, they have introduced legal texts in their regulatory frameworks that largely mirror the good clinical practice requirement of the ISO standard, but are not necessarily one-to-one. For example, in the US, you have a set of requirements depicted under the 21 CFR for investigational device exemptions that basically mirror a lot, if not all, almost all of the good clinical practice guideline requirements that have, for example, been put forth in the ISO. These are then enforced and reviewed by RBs if needed. And then what FDA also has done is that they've categorized the new ISO as a consensus standard, which means if you ensure that you document your clinical activities according to that standard, you can partly fulfill the CFR 21 requirements. However, US FDA does have some additional US specific requirements related to good clinical practice that you also need to make sure that you cover. So you always have to make sure that if you're following ISO 14155 for a multi-center global study, that the US specific good clinical practice requirements are taken care of, because they're not automatically taken care of by the ISO 14155. This might be as little as just making sure that documents are named correctly in specific ways and that you have appropriate agreements in place. In other places, for example, Oceania, Asia, Africa, there are local requirements from competent authorities or similar governing bodies that also introduce good clinical practice as a part of their regulatory framework. Most countries do consider the ISO 14155 as the global governing golden standard for a good clinical practice when it comes to medical device clinical studies. So, with that said, I'd like to provide Maria a chance to share a little bit of her experience on this topic as well. And she's going to start by introducing us to the major requirements of good clinical practice for clinical investigations per ISO 14155. Maria, the stage is yours.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. So Etienne is letting me know a little bit which slide we're on. For some reason, it doesn't show up very well on my screen, but I think we'll be doing fine right now. But I think we're on slide 17, right, Etienne?
Yes, that's correct.
Thanks. Yes. So major requirements, what I would like to perhaps rephrase that a little bit as is what's really new in the standard that came out in 2020, because that also answers to what the major requirements are. Because what's new is not completely new. It's sort of emphasized and strengthened what had already been presented in the previous two versions. So the first version of this standard came out 2003, and the second one, as John mentioned, in 2011. So it's basically a new version every 7 years or something like that. And currently, the ISO committee is working on the fourth version of this standard, which probably is going to come out in a couple of 3, 4, 5 years or something like that, perhaps earlier. So the changes or the major requirements is that the standard now starts with a very nice summary of the GCP principles, and I refer to them as clause or points here. If you open up the standard, so the standard is not available for free. You generally have to purchase it through one of the ISO organizations. Some charge more, local organizations, and some charge a bit less. Or it could be that your company has acquired this and it's part of your quality management system. But however you gain access to it, it's very helpful to have the standard both as a PDF, because you have this searchable PDF, or if you print it out and then you have it like a document. Because if you work in medical devices and clinical research of medical devices, I can assure you it's perhaps not like a Bible, but something very similar to a reference document that it's very nice to have easy access to and take notes for yourself and go back and forth and see how different topics are dealt with in different sections. So to go back to what's new and what's also the principal requirements of the standard is that it now starts with a summary of 13 GCP principles. We're going to go through that in a little while. And it also brings up that, as John mentioned, that there's this requirement now that you have to register your trial or your investigation or your study, they're all synonyms, in a publicly accessible database. So one of the most commonly known is, of course, clinicaltrials.com. And you also now have a timeline. I think the latest, I'm not 100% sure, but I think within 30 days of that you have your first patient enrolled in the study, that data needs to be publicly available. So that's further described in section 5.4. I think you shared that with the public, right, Etienne, these principles?
Yes, it's in the
Yeah,
chat
we'll share
now.
the slides at least.
Thank you. Yeah. So you have that in the chat box, in the chat window also. And then something else that also is much more emphasized now as a new requirement, and it's also gaining much more traction and attention, is the possibility of risk-based monitoring. So if we said that, I think it was 80/20 that had heard about the ISO standard prior to this webinar. But if you come from the world of pharma and GCP, of course, you know that one of the most costly phases of clinical research is the monitoring, is the auditing of the data and the continuous monitoring to make sure that you can secure the quality and the credibility of the data that you're collecting. So the industry has been going towards an attitude of allowing more risk-based monitoring, and how that risk is set up. It's FDA has some guidance document on it, but the ISO standard in itself doesn't speak about how to go ahead and perform this risk-based monitoring. But it's a little bit up to each CRO or to each manufacturer or each sponsor to identify the risk, to quantify it, and make sure how you what actions you take to decide, what should trigger a monitoring visit to the site. But the fact that we have the possibility of doing risk-based monitoring, it's everybody has something to win from that. Because of course it's a very time-consuming and costly activity to do, and especially we saw during the pandemic that monitoring was one of the phases or activities of clinical research that suffered the most, because it was almost impossible to gain access to the hospital, and if we did gain access, the hospitals were most likely overloaded and did not have as much time or attention to pay to this clinical research activity. So it's a very good initiative and something that will continue to develop over the next year with more guidance documents, also from a European perspective on how to go ahead and manage the risk-based monitoring. But for the time being, it's included, and it gives you the possibility to optimize and make your clinical research activity a bit more efficient and also cost sensitive. Then we have a section that is focusing now on the clinical quality management. This was also something that in the previous versions was not that well articulated, But now you have a specific focus on that. It is the sponsor's obligation to have a clinical quality management system. It doesn't bring out exactly what you have to do, but it does speak about certain procedures and processes that will harmonize how people are working. And also the sponsor needs to ensure that the people working and generating this clinical research and clinical evidence is appropriately trained and that understands that this data and procedures are sort of integrated into their clinical quality management system. Another thing that has also been on the rise basic for the past 10 years, and that also has a strong emphasis in the European MDR, the medical device regulation, is the focus on statistical consideration. This was prior to this ISO version, and also I would say prior to the MDR. It was something that it was a bit to be or not to be, in the sense that if you had a biostatistician, if you had a really strong endpoint, if you had some type of really academic intent to do something relevant with your data, perhaps you invested more time and money to develop your statistical endpoints. Now this is obligatory in the sense that in a pre-market setting, definitely you will need to have a well-defined endpoint analysis and justifying why the sample is one way rather than another way. But I would say even out into the post-market setting, it's important that your sample side has a scientific and statistical justification. And that is now the statistical considerations is emphasized in Annex A. And Annex A is also where you have a template for the clinical investigational plan, which is also the protocol then, but it's called CIP in the ISO 14155. And you have a very nice outline in Annex A that really describes to you the different section and what needs to be included in such a protocol or clinical investigation plan, including then the statistical component. And then there's another new annex called Annex G that really provides a good guidance to the ethics committees. So there are many different stakeholders in this ecosystem that we will look on in a few slides. But one of the relevant is, of course, the ethics committee that's responsible of looking at that the ethical principles are upheld and that the study is scientifically sound and that the data that is generated both respects the patient's privacy and confidentiality, and that it has scientific value. So it was nice also that this guidance document or guidance annex was included to people that works in this activity on the ethics committee side. But it also really helps, although you're not that stakeholder, but it's really nice to know what should I as a sponsor or as a clinical investigator do to make sure that their work is as perfect as possible. Because if you know what they will be looking at and what their procedure is, of course, your aim should be to try to comply with that as much as possible. And then I come back to what also John mentioned before, how this standard was harmonized and took into account another standard that was updated, which is the one on risk management, ISO 14971, and that also has a much stronger emphasis in the European MDR. So now risk management, according to this new version of ISO 14155, it's throughout the entire process of the clinical investigation. Before, risk management was more related to the pre-market setting because it will consider that you had a higher level of risk before you had commercialized the product. But now it's really throughout the life cycle, and there's a stronger emphasis on post-market clinical data in the MDR, because we all know that having a highly selected group of individuals in a small pre-market clinical study, perhaps 50, 60 patients, it's a completely different setting than we enter into the real world, collecting clinical data on a much larger group of people with different type of comorbidities and different type of complications. And that data, clinical evidence, is perhaps even more relevant than the one that you collect in the pre-market setting. So having an obligation on that, we are obliged now to look at the risk in the post-market setting, report on that risk, and use that risk that we understand and that data and feed it into the life cycle. And if we see that there's unacceptable risk or unknown risk, of course, we need to go back and perhaps do another study, a pre-market study, to make sure that, you know, what we think we know about our device is accurate and consistent and truthful or accurate, but not just in the pre-market setting, but in the entire life cycle of the device. And then there is this annex that I think John showed as one of his last slides, and it shows how these requirements, these GCP requirements, are applicable at different stages of clinical development. So we get a lot of questions on, as clinical consultants, do I need to follow ISO 155 if my product is already commercialized and I want to do a study in the post-market setting on indication? And the answer is yes, because the moment you start to collect clinical evidence, we have now this reference, this framework of how a best practice on how to do something in the best possible ways, so that regulatory authorities all over the globe will look at this data and say, okay, this is a sponsor or a manufacturer that they collected clinical data, they follow this best practice standard. So even if you are not collecting data for, let's say, a market authorization or putting your product on the market, but you want to use it within your clinical evidence of your product, you still need to have collected this data in a scientifically credible way, in an ethical way, respecting both the patients and the stakeholders involved in this ecosystem, and ensuring that the data that you collected that it represents the highest scientific and ethical standards that we have all agreed on that we want to follow. So that's why looking at this Annex Annex I, looking at that and sort of deciding where you are in a life cycle of your device at the moment, it will allow you to understand what's obligatory, because as with everything, something that is a guidance document or a standard or even a law, there are gray zones. Everything is not black and white, because nobody has been able to design a scenario that fits every possible scenario that a manufacturer or sponsor can have. So for sure, there are always interpretations. And especially since the innovation and development of devices is so fast, it's very difficult for the committees that writes these technical documents and guidance documents to think in advance of what could be the potential things that could occur for the next 5 to 7 to 10 years. So it's really important to use good judgments and common sense, and then you have to sort of look at this tree structure and understand what could be applicable for you for the different stages. But just having that overview is very helpful, Annex I. And then there's also an additional new annex, the Annex J, that gives guidance to auditors that are involved in clinical investigations audits. So just as I said, that there's a higher emphasis and focus on having a clinical quality management system, which many manufacturers had to invest a lot of time and resources to upgrade their clinical quality management system to make sure that they felt comfortable, that they had it as well prepared as they possibly could. There's also now a guidance document on how to audit that clinical quality management system. And again, just as with the ethics committee, if you go, even if you're not the auditor, but if you look at this is the instructions that the auditor will follow, you know a bit how to remedy that and mitigate for anything that you could possibly be exposed to in a clinical investigation audit. And obviously, you know, plan ahead to make sure that you can pass an audit successfully.
Maria?
So I think we can go to the next slide. Okay. Yeah.
Just want to make sure our slides were where we needed to be.
Yeah, so Maria, I think we confused the slides a little bit in terms of the numbering, but right now we're showing the summary of GCP principles now, where we present the first three GCP
Great.
principles. Do you see that as well?
Now I see. I'm following my PDF. I'm on slide 18.
Okay. Yeah, 18. Yes, correct. Now we're on the same
Great.
page.
So if I said what was new in the standard 2020, which I just spent 10 minutes speaking about, which one of them was the summary of the 13 GCP principles. We are now showing you these 13 principles in the next 3 slides. So, and I think that many people brush past that and say, you know, okay, it's just a summary. But if you really take time to contemplate, if especially if the standard is new to you, even if you worked in pharma, because this is similar to the GCP principles that comes from the pharma standard document also. But it's everything that we do in clinical research should be guided by ethical principles. And the ethical principle itself in the ISO 14155 has a whole clause dedicated to it. I think it's clause 5, that you have several pages that's related to what are the ethical principles. Another of these GCP principles is that the anticipated benefits must justify the risk. This is also something that's new, that has a higher focus in the new version of the ISO 14155. And it's similar to also the European MDR is really focusing on that. It's clear that when you're doing clinical research and when we're involved in research with pharma or with medical devices, obviously there are risks. As far as possible, we have to mitigate those risks through our risk management system before we even get to the clinical research phase. But whatever those risks are and whatever the benefits that we believe we can achieve with our new product or with our research, is that you clearly have to articulate and argue that your anticipated benefits outweigh the risks. It's not just justify the risk, but it actually outweighs it, because again, you have a scoring there. So, and that comes from your risk management file. So that's very important. There's no way that you can get by now and create an investigator's brochure or even a clinical investigation protocol or have a conversation with the ethics committee and not have that narrative well prepared. So anticipated benefits must outweigh or justify the risks. And then you always have to understand that you have to put people over science or society. So if you're in research, you could say somehow, but the science justifies that I expose some patients to risk. It could be that because in overall and for the good of humanity and so on. But that's not a GCP principle. It's the opposite. So people always come before science and society. It could be pretty clear to most of you, I hope, but it's definitely something that has to be emphasized over and over again to make sure that people use common sense and use this as a guiding attitude when sometimes we enter into these gray areas. And then there's emphasis on, I'm on slide 19 now, that you have to have collected and documented and present adequate previous preclinical data. So preclinical data can be bench testing, includes animal testing, includes cellular testing or any type of model system that you have. But the better you have organized your preclinical data, you will be in a much better position when you go into your clinical phase, because of course you're using that preclinical data and summarizing it in the investigator brochure. But it's also more and more conversations with the ethics committee, especially if you have a complicated and risky indication, to have a well-structured preclinical data dossier that you can pull data from and easily provide those concerns or questions that the regulatory authorities can have when they have to evaluate your research to give you approval to start the clinical trial. A lot of the preclinical data also goes into a detailed clinical investigation plan. And as I said, there's a specific annex that gives a good guidance on how to write such a clinical investigation plan. So I would say gone are those days where there was some type of creativity and you say, no, I want to start with this section before that section. There was like everybody had their sort of preferred way of writing a clinical investigation plan. I encourage you, use the template that's in the ISO standard. If you have a device that requires additional sections or additional subsections or bullet points, yes, for sure, you include that. But as far as possible, facilitate for the reviewers that they have to look at this type of documents, perhaps a dozen of those documents every day or a week to facilitate the review, because that also ensures that your review could be faster and you may have a quicker approval because they are able to understand your documentation. Many times a lack of approval or questions that may delay your approval, it's not because they're questioning your research, but it could be difficult to understand how you've structured it and where you're answering these mandatory questions and these mandatory requirements that needs to be included in the documentation. So as far as possible to sort of follow these templates and guidelines that have been provided, it facilitates the review and the analysis for everybody. Then another GCP principle is, of course, that you need to have an ethical and regulatory approval. So within the European Union, this is it's the Ethics Committee, it's the IRB in the US, and CA here stands for Competent Authority. It's the national authorities of each country that provide that approval if you are in a pre-market setting. If you're in a post-market setting, you're most likely only required to provide an ethics committee approval that they ensure that the science is, that the research is ethical and guided by scientific principles. But you would need a regulatory approval and an ethical approval. So the next slide is that you always have to, just as that you put people over society and science, you have to guarantee that although they participate in clinical research, they have to be offered the best possible medical care. That can never be a question about, that the quality of the care that they receive is as good as, or perhaps even better than what you would get if you were not involved in clinical research. Another requirement is that the research needs to be performed by qualified professionals. And here we come to how do you check that? And this is very important because this is where the qualification of investigators and of sites is included. So there's a long section also in the standard that brings up how do you demonstrate, how do you ensure, how do you demonstrate, and how do you document that you work with qualified professionals? It's part of the selection, having objective criteria. What does a professional that's working on this indication device, what type of experience, training, and education should such a professional have? And then that is documented and demonstrated and recorded, normally through a CV or through trainings that the sponsors give to the sites and the investigators. And you have tons of logs and tons of documents that where you sign and you make sure that you have taken the utmost care to make sure that the people involved in the research, that they have the right training, qualification, and education. Training, education, and experience to meet the requirements of the research. And then another important point is that the patient needs to participate in the research freely. And this is documented through an informed consent. So first of all, you document that they participate freely, and you also document that you have provided information around what the research will entail, and that they have the right to leave the research at any time that they want, but that their care will not be jeopardized, that they will continue to get the best possible medical care. So this is another thing. If ensuring that we work with qualified professionals requires a lot of administrative paperwork, then of course the whole process about informed consent is equally burdensome to document and ensure that you have the right records related to that. I'm just going to take a sip of water, excuse me. So then the next slide.
Yep.
So also accurate data recording and storing. This is, again, part of research is making sure that everything that we collect, nothing that isn't documented doesn't exist, for good and for bad. You know, so if you claim to have data and if you claim to have evidence that supports your case, if you don't have that document, of course, you cannot use it. So that's why accurate data recording and storing, and how you store that data and who has access to that data also is very well described now in the ISO standard, and it's also one of the GCP principles. Subject privacy and confidentiality, we know how important that is. The standard does not specifically bring up the European GDPR, but of course it says that you have to adhere to additional regulations and laws in the region that you're in. And in the European Union, the GDPR is such a principle that also needs to be taken into consideration. And then you also need to make sure, if you follow the GCP principles, that you need to use the devices appropriately. So that means that if you work with medical devices, you hear physicians may do something off-label, and that's sort of part of the research that the companies can take back to their R&D phase and continue to innovate and explore in different ways how to use the devices. But part of the GCP standard is that a device has an indication, it has an intended purpose, and it should be used according to that purpose that has been approved. And unless it's used for a different purpose and in a pre-market setting, that has been reviewed by an ethics committee and the authorities to approve that such usage. And then the 13th principle is sort of put there at the bottom, and it's that you need a quality management system with procedures that sort of entails all of these other 12 principles in detail. So next slide.
So,
sorry,
Maria.
John.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to, before we get to the next part, which is where you're going to be talking a little bit about how you as an organization can comply with good clinical practice, I'm a little bit curious about hearing from the audience where you are all in your clinical development stage. Because good clinical practice, like Maria said, is appropriate for different stages as well. And I think we have a poll prepared for that, Etienne. Is that right?
Yeah, opening it now. Which stage of development is your company in? Went ahead and opened that, so go ahead and start voting.
So one of the things, Maria, you mentioned before was the new change in terms of the appropriateness of the standard for post-market operations as well.
Yeah.
How do you reckon existing organizations that are producing devices, that have devices in the market, how do you reckon companies approach that particular requirement? Do you think it's even feasible to start enforcing that down existing companies, or?
Yeah, definitely. I would say they have no choice. It's first of all, it's like, I would do it a bit reverse. If you're collecting clinical evidence, you're evidently collecting them with a purpose, right? You want to use it in a regulatory submission, or to beef up your existing applications, or because you have a requirement. But nobody's collecting clinical evidence just because it's fun, or because, oh, wow, we don't know what we're going to do, and let's just, go out and collect clinical data. You're collecting it because somebody is requiring you to do that, either, proactively or, reactively. And unless you follow the best practice standard and saying, okay, this is, we have collected this evidence according to this standard, nobody's going to accept it. I mean, you may say, I'm going to collect it and I'm going to use it anecdotally for a marketing purpose. If that could be the only scenario where we would say, I'm not going to adhere to the ISO 14155. But here I come to, you have to apply some common sense. So you need, of course, to work with people with experience. You need to look at this Annex I and say, okay, this applies to me, this does not apply to me. It's the same thing. You have to understand what's my first name and last name. Who am I? Who am I not? You know, because if you say I am pre-market, of course, you're going to do a lot of unnecessary work that may not be relevant. If you, for example, just a thing as a statistical analysis, in a post-market setting, if you're mostly interested in some descriptive data because you're collecting real-world evidence, but you don't have let's say, a hypothesis, or you don't need to really justify an endpoint to a certain power, of course, you can spend less time in elaborating, let's say, the justification of your sample size. Those are things you have to understand. Again, you know, what am I going to use my data for? Again, it's not just in what market setting, but really what's my scientific purpose with the data. Does that a bit explain?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It's just because we've had conversations being on the part where we're supporting medical device companies where they're explaining that they find it difficult to understand that they might need to comply with good clinical practice.
I will be completely open for most companies want to do as little pre-market study as possible because it's the most costly. It was the most cumbersome from a regulatory perspective, and it's like as quickly as possible get to the post-market phase and do studies, big ones, collect data, but in a commercial setting, so you don't have to provide the devices for free. You can have the physicians use the device, and it becomes bearable from a cost perspective, because it is very expensive to do clinical research. But now you have to, you can do both. Of course, my message is you can both do clinical research in the post-market setting in a cost-economic way, following the ISO standard, without getting broke by doing it. But doing research and not having a sharp focus on that, I'm following that study, you're putting yourself at risk, because you can collect a lot of data and then you realize 6 months later, okay, I'm going to use this for submission in the US, and if I would just have followed the guidance document, I would have had another 300 patients that I could use for that submission. So, I mean, there's many aspects that, it's very recommendable to apply the standard. But again, from using your common sense, not going in and doing the things that you don't need to do. You need to know what you need to know, so you know what you don't need to know.
Yeah, no, that's true. You need to know your gaps before you close them. Yeah. So Etienne, how many companies or people do we have here online that are in the various stages?
Yeah,
of the
so
clinical development cycle.
Broken down by percentage, there are about 150 people who voted. Preclinical, 19%, pre-market, 34%, post-market, 13%, and then multiple devices, multiple stages, 33%. You should be able to see those results in the public chat.
Okay. So about 1/3 has multiple products and multiple stages. Is it correct? 13% are all in post-market?
Yeah.
13%, okay. Yes.
So it sounds to me like there's a lot of people working on devices and strategies for their devices throughout the whole life cycle.
Yeah.
So I think the one of the key takeaways here, we'll mention them later, is the applicability of it at those stages. But I'm going to be mindful of our time, so I'm going to let you continue with your presentation, Maria. We're now already at the page 23, key stakeholders.
Great. So how do we ensure GCP compliance in your organization? Who are the key stakeholders? So we have mentioned them. So the first and foremost is the sponsor. It has the overarching responsibility of the clinical research. Then a very important stakeholder is, of course, the investigator. that is collaborating. The investigator and the sponsor could sometimes be the same person if it's academia-sponsored research. Then you have the ethics committee and the regulatory authorities. But in addition to that, on slide 24, you see that there are more stakeholders involved in this ecosystem. And all these stakeholders, of course, will benefit hugely from understanding in detail the ISO 14155. So as you see, sponsor, investigator, ethics committee, authorities, research nurses, coordinators, data entry coordinators, CRO, monitors and CRAs, medical monitors, data managers, biostatisticians, and quality assurance personnel. These are some of the people. I'm sure you could fill up this list with more people, but my take-home message is that one of the principles was that you have to ensure that you work with qualified personnel. All of those people are the qualified personnel. So if you are the sponsor and you have to ensure that my biostatistician knows the protocol, because that's ensuring that, saying that they are qualified. If you're involved in the statistical analysis, at the minimum, you have to have shown that you have training on the protocol. It is your duty as a sponsor and as the ultimate responsible of this research is to demonstrate in one way or the other that these individuals are qualified and trained, and that they have the experience and dedication that correspond to the research that they're doing. So next slide.
Yep.
So I think that we have some chance to look at these takeaway messages. So pre and post market, again, we often, I'm in the post-market phase. I don't need to do this. I can do a little bit whatever I want and just get the research for free. So that's not accurate. Again, not from a legal perspective, nor from a business perspective, because it's much better to, as I said, understand which phase you're in, follow the guidance documents and the standards, and make sure that you are as far as possible collecting your clinical data and building your clinical evidence dossier according to the best in practice standards. What if I change something? Okay, I'm CE marked, but I now use this device in a different location. So a practical example, one device was used for hypertension in one part of the body. The exact same device was placed in another part of the body and used to treat a heart condition. But the sponsor thought that, but I'm already CE marked. I already have market access. I'm in the post-market phase. Of course you're not, because the CE mark corresponds to a therapeutic indication, to a patient population, and to an intended purpose. And if you change that or any of those components, of course, you need to get the CE mark for those new conditions. Do I need to generate new clinical evidence? Yes, that's correct. If you change something that has a significant impact that affects the safety and the performance of your device, evidently you need to collect more clinical evidence to prove again that your device is safe and performs as intended. And then I think another last component that I think is it's really important that people understand that the clinical evidence can be anywhere and everywhere. And that it's beyond that, it sounds like a slogan or like a movie title, but it's really, people sometimes are stuck into that. To get clinical evidence, I need to do a clinical investigation or a clinical study. But every manufacturer has much more clinical data than they are actually aware that they have in different phases, or some study that they may have done at a hospital and you are not really aware of it, or that you can collect a survey designed in a good way and get feedback from your users on what their experience with the device is, or you have patient questionnaires. The message is that what the European MDR is focusing a lot is clinical evidence. And clinical evidence is clinical data. And clinical data does not just come from a clinical investigation. It could come from the literature. And as I said, it can come from surveys. It can come from patient questionnaires. So that's part of your strategy when you develop your clinical evaluation plan, which is something also that's new in the MDR, that the clinical evaluation plan spans from the inception of your device, basically your idea and the concept, when you start to do the R&D and your risk management, until the decommissioning of the device. That's the entire clinical evaluation, and you can collect clinical evidence during that entire process. So I think that's important to remember. And it's exactly 4:00.
Thank you so much, Maria, for sharing your insights on this. It's been very helpful. I'd like to give the audience a couple of minutes to share some of the questions with us. So for that to work, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Etienne, do we get any good, juicy questions here that we can start off on?
Well, we have some questions that got a lot of votes. Danielle actually asked the question, should all studies be submitted to the publicly available database? Example, all validation studies, usability studies, and not only controlled trial studies.
John?
So it depends on the introduction of human subjects and the spectrum of introduction of human subjects in your investigation. The legal text in for example, the European Medical Device Regulation clarifies that you should be submitting studies to local competent authorities, and those competent authorities should have databases of some sort. And that database isn't up and running yet. The only database that is actually up and running and feasible to use right now is the clinicaltrials.gov. We have the EMEA database for pharmaceuticals, but there's no specific database in Europe for only device studies. So when you think of what studies do I have to apply for and get submissions for, it comes down to the local competent authorities and the regulatory authorities in the countries on whether you need to submit it or not. For example, you don't need to inform or apply for an application in Denmark, where I am, if you're doing a usability study where you're just looking to gather, feedback on general usability of the device. But as soon as you start introducing the device into treating a person, you are doing a human subject trial. And then there's a whole set of requirements from the local competent authorities about how much, whether you need to apply for that or not. So in short, not all types of studies need to be introduced, but as soon as you start introducing interventions on a human subject, you most often need to look at the local legislations.
Okay. Maria, any follow-up?
Yeah, I could say again, I am a huge fan of using common sense. Again, if see it from the patient perspective, think about people over science and society. If you are one of these research participants or one of your family members, would you want to know what are they doing on me, or what are they doing on my, parent or my relative? How to access that is through a publicly accessible database. So that's, again, whenever you're doing an intervention on human subjects, regardless if you're you're using the device exactly according to the way that it should be used, it's not like an intervention sense that exposing you to more risk than has already been approved for this device. But there's a research collected. Of course, you would want to have access to that. You want to know, they're collecting my data. What is that data being used for, and how can I also get access to that data? But if it's a validation study that you will never be able to access, it doesn't immediately affect you. Again, it's like John says, it's there will be databases available because there's a much stronger requirement now that all the data that we collect is shared with authorities. So when the UDAMED is fully functional and running, people will be able to access that in one way or the other. But for the time being, I think your guiding principle should be that if this involves human subjects, and if somebody has the interest of knowing anything about that data, yes, it's much better to take the time to register it than to not register it. That would be my answer.
I think that's a good answer, and I'm a huge fan of of common sense as well. So
yeah.
let's
we all know that that's not so common.
Yeah, common sense requires common background. That's difficult. So,
Yeah.
but let's move on to another question. I thought that was a good answer. Sonia asked, does ISO 14155 also reflect ICH E9R1, which introduced the estimates concept for statistical planning analysis?
Ooh, that's very
Yeah,
specific.
yeah,
Is
but
that
it's true. No, but it's true, Sonia. This is again the GCP standard for pharma products. It was always one step ahead. I don't want to say that because somebody's going to kill me that's working on the ISO 14155. But anyway, it's true. It's they mimic each other a lot. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's clear that the emphasis on statistical requirements and justifications, they are probably not a copy paste. I don't know in detail that standard, but I do know that, of course, they have followed the same process of requiring better statistical justification.
yeah? So
Both
when we
products,
referred
yeah.
to that particular part of the guideline, which is E9 that she's referring to, there's a number of topics, things that are introduced there, such as how you should conduct sensitivity analysis and so forth. We have to remember that a lot of these guidelines that are produced for pharma are based on the fact that you're introducing drugs to the human body, and when you introduce drugs to the human body, there's a set of biological measurements that you need to conduct. For devices, there are devices that may not introduce, we just know theoretically they will not produce or intervene with a biological substance or have any effect on a biological structure of the body, and as such the statistical considerations might not be as prominent to plan out for device study. I know that statistical analysis plan and data management plans are a big part of the good clinical practice for all types of studies. So that's a part of that guideline that you could maybe take into account as a reference. But I don't think it reflects one-to-one, like Maria says. Pharma might be working on a certain trajectory. A part of that trajectory might be to include parts of that as well in the next version, but it's not one-to-one.
No.
Okay. Okay, next question comes from Sandra. Pharma clinical studies can sometimes include also collection of health economic data, reimbursement, pricing support. In your experience, do medical device companies also collect this type of economic data during pre-market studies?
Can I
It's
answer,
becoming,
John?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I say yes, it's becoming more and more frequent, of course. And again, I think pharma has been leading the way. Devices have followed. Then I think we're in a period where devices now, because of the new technological developments, and it's like innovation is not linear; it's exponential. I think we're seeing also an incredible boost in medical device technology development, which is going to be like, it's not just going to follow what pharma did and we replicate it, but put different names and make things a little bit less complex, but that we're actually going to develop standalone requirements. But it's true, it is more and more required, but perhaps from a business perspective, it's not always so required from let's say the regulatory authorities or the buyers, like an insurance company and so on, because I think it's we are basically 2 decades into really booming medical device development. You could say it started really strongly in the beginning of the 2000s. So I think that's one of my feedback. We see it more and more, and I think it's going to grow. What do you think, John?
No, I agree. I totally agree. It's becoming more popular for device studies to include health economic parameters because of the reimbursement needs, the procurement needs, and also just general commercial needs. So I highly suggest people evaluate that possibility to include 1 or 2 endpoints that capture that.
Okay, so I'll just remind those listening, if you have questions you definitely want us to get to, put those in the Q&A, but also there are a lot of questions already in the Q&A, so if you want to go in and vote or upvote those, I'm kind of going through these based on what the audience has decided is the most applicable question. So hopefully that is accurate. This is kind of a choose your own adventure. So get in there and upvote the questions you'd like. The next one is from Samradni, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. How do I decide sample size for pre-market clinical investigation? So
that's a very good question.
Okay.
Some of you might have heard about the medical device sample size cookbook that we published almost 4 years ago now. It's available online. If you Google it, medical device sample size cookbook, you can download it for free. It's a 30-some page document that I co-authored with a statistician, which actually digs into that part. Essentially, you need to have a couple of parameters outlined, one of which is your primary goal, the hypothesis that you're making, and the statistical testing you want to make on that hypothesis. So I would suggest that we drop maybe that link into the chat, or we at least share that with the audience afterwards during the webinar.
just dropped it in the chat. So if anyone
Great.
has trouble,
Thank
let
you.
me know.
And I just like to add something there again. And you really have to think about, so why are you doing clinical research? You know, why do you even go into pre-market phase? And it's a risk that you have identified in your risk management, your preclinical phase, that you could not explain or mitigate for with the preclinical research you've done. So you already know that there will be some type of adverse event or some type of event that will happen that you would want to eliminate or to reduce as much as possible. So I'm just saying, let's say mortality. So, you know, there's a risk that 1% of my patient dies. So you already know that, okay, I need to estimate the sample size. If I know that 1 out of 100 patients may die of this intervention, it's clear that, okay, I cannot have a sample size of 10. If it's 1 in 100, I need to at least look at 100 patients to be able to see that this may happen in one of the patients. So people often think about, how will I know what my sample size is? But the question before that is really, what's your remaining risk from the risk management? What do you think that is the risk that you will need to demonstrate that you have done everything to prove that your device is as safe as possible and that it performs well? So that risk is really minimized. And that's how you sort of start from that direction, I would say.
Etienne, how much time do we have left? I'm just wondering whether we have enough minutes.
Well, looks like we have about 10 minutes left. Maybe a few more questions if you all are good to go a little bit more. Also, if we don't get to your question, we will send those questions to both Jon and Maria. So if you are able to answer those, we can get those answers to you as well. So
cool.
A few more minutes. Let's see. Brittany asked the question, in your experience, how much pushback from investigational sites have you had with regards to direct entry of data into the CRFs? In essence, no source worksheets, since ISO states CIP can detail what data can be directly recorded into the CRFs.
Luckily, I have not had as much site conversations as Maria might have had, but do you have any opinions on that, Maria? Or
yeah, I can say that if I understand her question, Brittany's question, we know that sites like to work with worksheets, okay, because it's often part of the process is that they do the activity. They you know, it's not part of their standard protocol to capture that data. So somehow they want to have this intermediate document worksheet that sort of captures that data, and that of course transforms into a source document. And as if it's a source document, it needs to be signed and dated, and I mean it's a whole administrative hurdle on sort of making sure that you transform that worksheet into a source document. So if there's any chance that they can enter it directly, but then you don't have a source for it, I think that's what she's asking for. So I see. No, she's not saying. Yeah, but
yeah, I mean, the question is often whether you can consider the data capture solution as the primary source, or the CRF, if you're using paper, as the primary source, or whether the scribbled down worksheet is considered the primary source.
I can't answer that question here. It depends, you know. It will depend on the type of data and how you can back up that. And again, sorry to say, but it's since you really have to apply common sense, because you can want to try to be compliant as far as possible, but you need also to work with the sites. We know that, because without the sites, we have no data at all. So it's finding that right balance of, when do I have an external worksheet and I capture that there? When do I enter it directly into the CRF because the CIP allows it? And around that, what you should remember is, as long as you document the process, and you can always use the tool, a note to file, and say, okay, we are in a situation we don't really know how to do here. This is according to 30th of May 2023. We felt this was the best practice. So we did that. If somebody then comes back and say, no, this is horrible, you can't do it this way, I say, okay, we will do it better now. But you know, what you can't do is not pretend that the problem doesn't exist, or just say, no, this is too big, so we're not going to face it at all. Most of the times you can explain things with note to files, and then if you took the wrong type of decision at the moment, you go back and you correct it.
Mm-hmm. Well, as far as my experience goes, I have heard multiple manufacturers define their electronic data capture ECRF as, for example, their primary source of data. And then if they use worksheets to transfer that information from their hats to their data capture system, that's fine, but you still consider the centralized system as the primary source data.
Okay. All right. So kind of shifting gears then a little bit, Marianne is asking, what are your thoughts on studies that use residual bank samples performed in the pilot, pivotal, PMS stages?
Okay. Well, thoughts in terms of what?
Yeah,
in terms
that's
of
what else I said.
practice?
Thoughts in terms of what exactly?
If we're talking residual banked samples, I guess we're talking biological samples that might have been collected in one or another way. I guess from my perspective, one thing that you need to think of is, do we have the applicable permissions in terms of consenting, for example, from those people that have provided those samples to utilize them for clinical research or sponsored research? That's one of the first thoughts that I had on this. Because sometimes these samples are acquired in general practice in terms of documenting cancer or any of the diseases in a biobank, and there are sometimes consents in countries applicable to enable research to access those samples for general reasons. In other cases, that might not be the case. I don't know. Have you worked on any studies like that, Maria?
Yeah, definitely. So this must be an in vitro diagnostic product they refer to. So clearly, with this, there's a specific ISO standard that describes how to do clinical research on IVD products. It's very similar to the ISO 14155, but one of the big differences is the samples. If there were either, as you said, stored samples or new samples. But regardless of the component of consent is always relevant. In many cases in biobanks, of course, the consent was collected when they left their sample the first place. But it's always something you need to bring up with ethics committees, because it depends on what you will use the research for. So I would say, again, it depends. But you do need it in these different stages. I would say it depends more on what you're going to use the research for, how you have to face the issue of consent. But you can't not think about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I put in the name of the standard in the chat. 29116.
Okay, and I put the link as well under that, so those can find that.
Cool.
Good teamwork there. So I suppose let's make this the last question. You guys have been talking for a long time, and this is kind of a big question, and I actually want to expand it even bigger. So what about studies with software as a medical device? Does ISO 14155 apply? But I might also apply it to AI as well, because I know a lot of people are talking about AI. So I don't know if you want to weave that in somehow, but just what are your thoughts there? What about those?
Do you want to kick that off, John?
Yeah, it's very simple. Yes, it applies. There's no question about it. It's a medical device. And the same goes for AI. The trouble with AI is that it's difficult to validate. So you would have to standardize the validation process as a part of your study, and document that the procedures that you've conducted in terms of testing and validating the functionality of the software is according to regulatory validation requirements. But in terms of risk management, I think that's where, like Mario talked about, the overall risk management of the whole study itself and what implications it could have on the subject if it produces wrong results is taken into account when you conduct a study. What if the software during the study says something to a physician that could kill the patient? Of course, medical device software has to comply with ISO, because if the software tells you to give the patient 20 times the doses of normal doses, and somebody does it, your software actually killed the patient. So, of course, it applies to software too.
Great answer. I think that makes sense. Did you have a follow-up, Maria?
Yeah, I put in there in the chat that, of course, we are faced now with unique regulatory challenges when it comes to software and AI. As John said, there's such a rapid dynamics and